I'm 28 now, but I still remember every detail of that summer when I was 20. The summer that shattered my faith in family and taught me how easily truth can be buried under lies. I just finished my sophomore year at Ohio State University, excited to come home to Westerville for what I thought would be a relaxing break before my junior year. Instead, I walked into our split level ranch house to find my 18-year-old brother Dylan sitting at our kitchen table with our parents holding up what looked like a credit card statement. The expression on his face was a mixture of fake concern and barely concealed satisfaction. Baker used Dad's card for his spring break trip. He announced, his voice dripping with false worry. Our mother Susan gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. My father Mark's face turned crimson with disappointment and rage. Before I could even process what was happening, before anyone asked for my side of the story, my father's voice thundered through our modest home. You're grounded for the entire summer. No car, no friends, no job interviews. How could you steal from us? The shock hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen in our doorway, my duffel bag still slung over my shoulder, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Dylan sat there looking like the perfect, concerned brother, occasionally glancing at me with what appeared to be sympathy, but felt more like gloating. The credit card statement lay spread across our oak kitchen table, like evidence in a courtroom, and I could see charges totaling $700 from Panama City Beach during spring break week. Dad, I never touched your credit card. I managed to say, my voice cracking with disbelief. I was on campus during spring break. I worked extra shifts at the campus bookstore to save money. My mother shook her head sadly. Baker, we have the proof right here. These charges were made during your spring break, and Dylan showed us the photos you posted on social media from Panama City Beach. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. Yes, I had posted photos from Panama City Beach, but those were from the previous year when I went with my roommate Jason and his family. I had reposted them this spring as throwback memories, something I thought was harmless nostalgia. But Dylan had used those innocent posts to build his case against me. Those photos are from last year. I protested, but my father was already standing up, his hand extended expectantly. Car keys, phone, and laptop, now. His voice carried a finality that made my stomach drop. I'm calling Mr. Henderson first thing Monday morning to tell him you won't be taking that internship at his engineering firm. The internship. I had worked so hard to secure that position, networking at career fairs, and perfecting my resume. It was supposed to be my stepping stone into the professional world, my chance to gain real experience in civil engineering. But as I watched my father's determined expression, I knew there would be no changing his mind. Dylan finally spoke up, his voice carefully modulated to sound supportive. I'm really sorry this happened, Baker. I found the statement when I was helping Dad organize his office, and I just couldn't keep it secret. Family has to look out for each other, you know? The way he said it made my skin crawl. There was something theatrical about his performance, but our parents were completely buying into it. I handed over my belongings like a convicted criminal, watching as my summer plans evaporated before my eyes. Within hours, it became clear that Dylan had not kept this discovery to himself. My phone buzzed incessantly with confused texts from friends before my father confiscated it. Emma, my girlfriend of 8 months, had already heard the news from her friend Rachel, whose mother was friends with my mother. The small-town gossip network had activated with impressive speed. By evening, Emma had driven over to our house. I watched from my bedroom window as she stood on our front porch, her blonde hair catching the setting sun. When my father called me down to speak with her, I hoped she might be there to offer support, or at least hear my side of the story. Instead, she looked at me with disappointment and hurt. Baker, I thought I knew you. How could you steal from your own family and then lie about it? Emma, I'm telling you the truth. I never used that card. Someone is setting me up. She shook her head, tears forming in her green eyes. The evidence is right there. Dylan wouldn't lie about something like this. He's your brother." She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message. "I can't date someone who's dishonest. I'm sorry, Baker. We're done." As I watched her drive away in her red Honda Civic, I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart over losing Emma, but my fundamental belief in fairness and truth. I was being punished for a crime I didn't commit, and everyone I cared about believed I was guilty. That night I lay on my childhood bed, staring at the glow in the dark stars I had stuck to my ceiling in middle school. Through the thin walls, I could hear Dylan on the phone with someone his voice cheerful and carefree. Occasionally I caught snippets of conversation about his plans for the summer plans that apparently included taking over my scheduled work hours at Peterson's auto shop, where I had worked part-time during high school. The isolation was immediate and suffocating. Without my car, I was trapped in our suburban neighborhood. Without my phone, I was cut off from my college friends. Without my laptop, I couldn't even work on summer coursework or job applications. I was effectively under house arrest in my own home. The worst part was watching Dylan move through the house with newfound confidence. He had always been the younger brother living somewhat in my shadow academically and socially. But now he carried himself differently, like someone who had finally found his moment to shine. When our parents weren't around, he would give me these small smiles that seemed to say he knew exactly what he was doing. By the end of my first week home, Dylan had convinced our parents that I should pay back the $700 from my college fund. "It's only fair," he argued. "Baker needs to take responsibility for his actions, and actions have consequences." I watched helplessly as my father transferred $700 from my savings account money I had earned working construction jobs the previous summer under the blazing Ohio sun. Money that was supposed to help cover my junior year tuition costs. Dylan nodded approvingly as the transaction went through, playing the role of the wise younger brother who understood justice. That night I noticed Dylan carrying several shopping bags up to his room. When I questioned him about it the next morning, he casually mentioned that he had been saving money from his part-time job at the movie theater. But I knew how much that job paid, and it wasn't enough to afford the designer clothing brands I had glimpsed in those bags. Something was very wrong, but I was the only one who seemed to see it. As June progressed, I watched my brother transform from my parents' second son into their golden child. The shift was subtle at first, then became increasingly obvious as Dylan basked in his newfound status as the responsible, trustworthy son who had saved the family from further financial loss by exposing my alleged theft. Our parents, Mark and Susan, began treating Dylan with a respect and admiration that I realized I had taken for granted when it was directed toward me. They asked for his opinions on family decisions, praised his maturity, and constantly referenced his difficult choice to turn in his own brother as evidence of his strong moral character. Dylan wasted no time capitalizing on this reversal of fortune. Within 2 weeks of my grounding, he had convinced our parents to let him move into what was supposed to be my room when I graduated. It was the larger bedroom at the front of the house, with better natural light and its own adjoining bathroom. I watched from my childhood bedroom as he moved his belongings, including several new items that seemed to appear daily. The expensive purchases became impossible to ignore. Dylan suddenly had a brand new iPhone to replace his cracked older model, a pair of $200 Nike basketball shoes, and a gaming setup that included a curved monitor and mechanical keyboard. When I mentioned these purchases to our parents, suggesting that perhaps Dylan's minimum wage theater job couldn't fund such extravagant spending, they dismissed my concerns immediately. "Baker, you're just jealous that Dylan is being responsible with his money while you squandered ours," my mother said, not even looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Maybe if you had made better choices, you'd have nice things too." Dylan had an explanation for everything. The phone was a graduation gift from our grandmother. The shoes were on clearance. The gaming equipment was purchased with money he had been saving for months. Every answer came quickly and confidently, and our parents accepted each explanation without question. But I knew our grandmother lived on a fixed income and had never given gifts that expensive. I knew Dylan rarely shopped clearance sales, preferring brand names and the latest models. And I knew he had been spending his theater money on gas, fast food, and dates with various girls from his high school class. The social implications of my situation became clearer as the summer wore on. Dylan made sure that everyone in our extended family neighborhood and social circle knew about my supposed crime. At the 4th of July barbecue at our cousin Jennifer's house, I overheard Dylan telling our Uncle Robert about how difficult it had been for him to discover my betrayal of the family trust. It really broke my heart, Uncle Robert. Dylan said, his voice heavy with manufactured emotion. Baker was always someone I looked up to, you know. But I couldn't let Mom and Dad keep getting hurt financially. Someone had to step up and tell the truth. Our relatives rallied around Dylan, praising his courage and maturity. They looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and pity, if they acknowledged me at all. I spent most of the barbecue sitting alone on the back porch, watching my former life play out without me while Dylan held court as the family hero. The most infuriating part was Dylan's public persona versus his private behavior. Around our parents and other adults, he was thoughtful, helpful, and humble about his role in exposing my alleged theft. But when we were alone, or when he thought no one was paying attention, I caught glimpses of something else entirely. I started noticing that Dylan would stay out much later than his stated curfew, returning home well after our parents had gone to bed. He would slip into the house through the back door sometimes with the faint smell of alcohol on his breath. When I mentioned this to our parents, Dylan smoothly explained that he had been working extra shifts to help support the family during our financial difficulty. Baker's theft really put a strain on our budget, he told our father one morning over breakfast. I want to do my part to help us recover. Our father actually teared up at this display of familial loyalty, reaching over to squeeze Dylan's shoulder with pride. You're a good son, Dylan. Your mother and I are lucky to have you. Dylan had also begun dating Sarah Mitchell, one of the most popular girls from his graduating class. Sarah was beautiful, confident, and came from one of the wealthier families in town. I couldn't understand how Dylan, working minimum wage at a movie theater, was managing to take her to expensive restaurants and buy her gifts that I saw him carrying to his car. When Sarah started coming to our house regularly, I was subjected to the humiliation of being the older brother who was grounded and discredited. She would look at me with curiosity and mild revulsion, clearly having heard Dylan's version of events. Sometimes I would catch her whispering with Dylan, and I knew they were discussing my supposed criminal behavior. The breaking point came when Dylan began throwing parties at our house during the evenings when our parents worked late shifts. Our father worked security at a local factory 3 nights a week, and our mother had picked up extra hours at the insurance office, where she worked as a claims processor. Dylan would invite 6 or 7 friends over, including Sarah, and they would drink beer and play music in our living room. The first time this happened, I went downstairs to confront Dylan about the noise and the obvious underage drinking occurring in our family home. His friends looked at me with a mixture of amusement and disdain as I tried to assert some authority as the older brother. Relax, Baker, Dylan said calmly, not even getting up from the couch where he was sitting with Sarah on his lap. We're not causing any trouble. Maybe if you hadn't stolen from Dad, you could join us instead of being stuck upstairs like a little kid. His friends laughed, and I felt my face burn with humiliation. I was 20 years old, a college student being dismissed by teenagers in my own home. When I threatened to tell our parents about the party, Dylan's expression shifted to something colder. Go ahead, he said. Tell them their thief son is causing more problems. I'm sure they'll believe you over me. He was right, and we both knew it. I had lost all credibility in my family, while Dylan's word had become gospel. I retreated to my room, seething with frustration and powerlessness. The parties continued twice a week throughout July. I would lie in bed, listening to the laughter and conversation below, feeling like a prisoner in my own home. Sometimes I would look out my window and see Dylan's friends smoking cigarettes in our backyard or making out on our front porch, treating our property like their personal playground. But the most devastating blow came at the end of July when Dylan announced that he had been accepted to Columbus State Community College on a hardship scholarship. He gathered our family around the kitchen table, his acceptance letter spread out like a trophy. The financial aid office was really understanding about our family's situation. He explained, his voice modest but proud. They said students who demonstrate resilience in the face of family financial crisis are exactly who they want to help. Our parents were ecstatic. They hugged Dylan and praised his determination to pursue higher education despite the family turmoil I had supposedly caused. But something about the scholarship didn't sit right with me. I knew hardship scholarships were typically reserved for families with documented low-income unemployment or other significant financial struggles. Our family was solidly middle class. Yes, my alleged theft of $700 had created a temporary budget strain, but it wasn't the kind of genuine hardship that merit-based aid was designed to address. It seemed like Dylan had used my supposed crime to fraudulently qualify for financial assistance intended for students who truly needed it. When I tried to raise this concern with our parents, they shut me down immediately. Baker, your brother, is trying to better himself and contribute positively to this family, my mother said sharply. Instead of trying to tear him down, maybe you should focus on how you're going to make things right. As I watched Dylan accept congratulations and praise for his scholarship, I realized that my brother wasn't just taking advantage of an opportunity. He was actively constructing a narrative that positioned him as the hero and me as the villain, and he was getting rewarded for it at every turn. The worst part was that I was starting to question my own sanity. Everyone around me was so convinced of my guilt and Dylan's innocence that I began to wonder if I was missing something obvious. Had I somehow used my father's card and forgotten about it? Was I repressing memories of wrongdoing? But every time I tried to find a logical explanation for how I could have made those charges, the facts didn't add up. I'd been on campus during spring break working at the bookstore and studying for midterm exams. I'd never been to Panama City Beach during the time frame when those charges were made. Someone was lying, and it wasn't me. But proving the truth seemed impossible when everyone had already decided which version of events they preferred to believe. By August, Dylan's deception had evolved into something truly sophisticated and sinister. What had started as a simple, false accusation had grown into an elaborate psychological campaign designed to completely destroy my reputation and credibility while elevating Dylan to near sainthood in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Dylan's manipulation extended far beyond our immediate family. He had begun cultivating relationships with our extended relatives, family friends, and community members, always playing the role of the mature young man who was bravely holding the family together during a difficult time. The performance was masterful, and I watched in horrified fascination as he convinced person after person that he was the victim of my supposed betrayal. Our grandmother Eleanor, who lived in a retirement community 20 minutes away, became one of Dylan's primary targets. Eleanor had always been particularly fond of me, proud of my academic achievements and college success. But Dylan began visiting her weekly, something he had never done before my grounding. He would bring her small gifts, help with her apartment cleaning, and gradually work my supposed theft into their conversations. During one of these visits, which I learned about from our mother, Dylan had broken down in tears while telling Eleanor about the financial burden my actions had placed on the family. He painted a picture of our parents struggling to pay bills, cutting back on necessities, and facing the possibility of taking out loans to cover the damage I had caused. None of this was true. My parents were annoyed about the $700, but it hadn't created genuine financial hardship. They both had steady jobs, and our family was comfortable, if not wealthy. But Dylan's performance was so convincing that Eleanor called our house that evening to offer financial help. I don't want to see Mark and Susan suffer because of Baker's poor choices, she told my mother over the phone, her voice shaky with emotion. I can give Dylan some money for his college expenses. That boy has been through enough. I listened to this conversation from the top of the stairs, my heart breaking, as I realized how completely Dylan had poisoned our grandmother's opinion of me. Eleanor ended up giving Dylan $1,500 from her savings money she had been carefully preserving on her fixed income. Dylan accepted it with appropriate humility and gratitude, never mentioning that our family wasn't actually in financial distress. But Dylan's cruelest manipulation involved creating new incidents designed to make me look increasingly unstable and dangerous. He began hiding family valuables and then expressing concern about their disappearance, always in ways that suggested I might be responsible without directly accusing me. The first incident involved my mother's jewelry box, which contained several pieces that had been gifts from my father over the years. Dylan mentioned casually at dinner that he had noticed the jewelry box had been moved from its usual spot on my parents' dresser. I'm probably just being paranoid. He said, his voice carefully worried. But after everything that's happened, I thought I should mention it. Our parents immediately went upstairs to check, and while nothing was missing, the seed of suspicion was planted. They began locking their bedroom door when they left the house, and I noticed my mother moving her purse to different locations, presumably to keep it away from me. Dylan escalated this strategy 2 weeks later when our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned that someone had been in her garage, apparently looking through her husband's tool collection. Nothing was stolen, but the garage door had been left open, and tools were scattered around. "That's strange," Dylan said, when Mrs. Patterson told us about the incident over our back fence. "Baker, you weren't working on any projects that might require tools, were you?" The implication was clear, and Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from friendly concern to suspicious wariness as she looked at me. I denied any involvement, but the damage was done. Word spread through our neighborhood that the Hendricks boy who had stolen from his own family might be expanding his criminal activities. The most devastating incident occurred during a family gathering at our house in mid-August. Dylan had invited several of our relatives for a backyard barbecue, ostensibly to demonstrate that the family was healing and moving forward despite my supposed betrayal. Our cousins Jennifer and Michael came with their families along with Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda. Earlier that day, Dylan had asked to borrow my high school class ring, claiming he wanted to show it to his girlfriend Sarah as an example of what his own ring might look like when he graduated. I thought it was an odd request, but I was desperate for any positive interaction with my brother, so I gave it to him. During the barbecue, while I was helping our mother bring food outside, Dylan discovered my class ring in the pocket of Uncle Robert's jacket, which was hanging on a chair near our back door. He held it up with apparent shock and confusion. "Uncle Robert, why do you have Baker's ring?" Dylan asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. Uncle Robert was genuinely bewildered. He had no idea how the ring had gotten into his jacket pocket, and his confusion was obvious to everyone present. But Dylan's discovery created an incredibly uncomfortable situation that seemed to suggest I had planted my own ring on our uncle for some unknown reason. Maybe Baker was trying to create evidence that someone else was stealing things, Dylan suggested quietly to our cousin Jennifer, but loud enough for others to hear. Like to make himself look less guilty, I watched in horror as my family members exchanged glances that clearly indicated they thought I was capable of such manipulation. Uncle Robert looked at me with disappointment and genuine hurt, probably wondering if I was attempting to frame him for something. "I didn't put that ring in Uncle Robert's pocket," I said desperately. "Dylan, you had my ring earlier today. You know how it got there." But Dylan looked at me with what appeared to be genuine sadness and concern. "Baker, I gave your ring back to you hours ago. Don't you remember? You put it on your dresser." I knew this was a lie, but I couldn't prove it. The ring had clearly been in my possession earlier, and now it was found in a suspicious location. Dylan's version of events was plausible enough that our relatives couldn't definitively say what had happened, but the incident reinforced their belief that something was seriously wrong with me. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. I found myself second-guessing my own memories and actions, wondering if I was somehow losing my grip on reality. Dylan had created an environment where anything bad that happened could potentially be traced back to me, and I had no way to defend myself against accusations that were carefully constructed to seem plausible. The final blow came when Dylan convinced our parents to request a police wellness check on me. He approached them privately one evening, expressing concern that I had been making vague, threatening statements about getting revenge on the family for not believing my protests of innocence. This was completely untrue. While I had certainly expressed frustration about my situation, I had never threatened anyone or anything. But Dylan painted my frustration as something more sinister, suggesting that my anger was escalating and that he was genuinely worried about everyone's safety. When Officer Martinez arrived at our house the next afternoon, I was mortified. He was professional and polite, but his presence sent a clear message to our neighbors and anyone else who might be watching. The Hendricks family was dealing with a son who had become enough of a problem to warrant police intervention. Officer Martinez spoke with me privately for about 15 minutes, asking about my mental state, my plans for the future, and whether I was having thoughts of harming myself or others. I answered honestly, explaining my frustration with being falsely accused, but emphasizing that I had no intention of hurting anyone. But the damage was done. Officer Martinez suggested to my parents that they might want to consider professional counseling for me, noting that young adults sometimes struggle with accountability and that my continued denial of obvious evidence might indicate deeper psychological issues. As I watched the police car drive away from our house, I realized that Dylan had achieved something truly remarkable. He had convinced everyone who mattered that I was not only a thief, but potentially mentally unstable and dangerous. Meanwhile, he continued to be praised and rewarded for his maturity, honesty, and concern for family welfare. I had become a pariah in my own home and community, while my younger brother was celebrated as a hero. The injustice was so complete and so skillfully orchestrated that I began to wonder if I would ever be able to prove my innocence or restore my reputation. But I didn't know that salvation was coming from an unexpected source, and that Dylan's perfect performance was about to be scrutinized by someone with the skills and experience to see through his elaborate deception. The turning point in my nightmare began on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late August when my father's older sister, Margaret, arrived for an unannounced visit. I was upstairs in my room reading a book I had borrowed from our neighborhood library when I heard her distinctive voice drifting up from the front hallway. Aunt Margaret was nothing like the other adults in my life who had accepted Dylan's story without question. At 45, she was a forensic accountant who worked for a firm that investigated financial crimes and corporate fraud. She had sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, graying brown hair that she kept in a no-nonsense style, and a personality that had always made me slightly nervous during family gatherings. Margaret asked direct questions and expected honest answers, and she had an unsettling ability to detect inconsistencies in people's stories. I hadn't seen her since Christmas, when the family dynamics had been completely different. At that time, I had been the successful college student with a bright future, while Dylan was just my younger brother finishing high school. Margaret had congratulated me on my academic achievements and asked detailed questions about my engineering studies and career goals. Now, as I listened to her greeting my parents, I wondered what Dylan had told her about our family situation. I assumed she had heard some version of his story about my supposed theft and was probably here to offer support during our family's difficult time. But as the afternoon progressed, I began to notice that Margaret's visit felt different from the typical family social calls we had been receiving. Instead of focusing on offering sympathy or advice, she seemed to be observing and asking questions that made everyone slightly uncomfortable. I came downstairs for dinner to find Margaret studying Dylan with an intensity that made him fidget in his chair. She had been asking him about his summer activities, his college plans, and his part-time job at the movie theater. The question seemed innocent enough, but there was something probing about her approach that Dylan clearly didn't appreciate. "So Dylan, you're planning to study business at Columbus State?" Margaret asked, cutting into her meatloaf with precision. "That's interesting. What attracted you to that field?" Dylan launched into what sounded like a rehearsed answer about wanting to help families achieve financial stability and security. It was exactly the kind of response that had been winning him praise from other adults, emphasizing his maturity and his desire to contribute positively to society. But Margaret's follow-up questions revealed details that didn't quite add up. She asked about specific courses in the business program, about his long-term career goals, and about how he planned to balance work and school responsibilities. Dylan's answers became increasingly vague and contradictory, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "And you're managing to save money for college while working part-time," Margaret continued. "That's impressive financial discipline for someone your age. You must have learned some valuable lessons about budgeting and prioritizing expenses." Dylan nodded enthusiastically, but I caught a flicker of something that looked like panic in his eyes. "Yeah, I've always been good with money. I learned from watching Mom and Dad, you know." Margaret smiled, but it was the kind of smile I'd seen her use during Christmas dinner, when our cousin Jason had tried to convince everyone he was getting excellent grades while clearly struggling in school. It was patient, polite, and completely skeptical. After dinner, while Dylan retreated to his room claiming he had homework to complete, Margaret helped our parents clean the kitchen. I was wiping down the table when I overheard her casual comment that would change everything. "It's nice to see Dylan taking on more responsibility during a difficult time," she said to our mother. Though I have to admit I'm curious about the details of what happened with Baker's situation. As someone who investigates financial irregularities professionally, I'd be interested in reviewing the evidence just to make sure everything was handled properly. My heart stopped. Our parents exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to decide whether Margaret's offer was helpful or intrusive. My father spoke first, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "Margaret, we appreciate your concern, but the situation is pretty straightforward. Dylan found the charges on my credit card statement, and Baker had the opportunity and motive to make them. We don't need a professional investigation." But Margaret persisted, her tone remaining friendly but firm. "I understand, Mark, but financial crimes can be more complicated than they appear on the surface. Sometimes what looks like obvious evidence actually tells a different story when you examine it more carefully. I'd be happy to take a look just to give everyone peace of mind." Dylan appeared in the kitchen doorway claiming he needed a glass of water. But I could tell he had been listening to the conversation, and his expression was tense with worry that he was trying to hide behind casual interest. "What kind of things would you look for, Aunt Margaret?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Margaret turned to him with that same patient smile. "Oh, there are lots of technical details that most people don't think about. Transaction patterns, location data, timing, inconsistencies, that sort of thing. It's amazing how much information is actually embedded in financial records when you know how to read them properly." Over the next 2 days, Margaret's presence in our house created a subtle but noticeable shift in the family atmosphere. She spent time talking with each of us individually, asking questions that seemed casual but felt more substantial than typical family conversation. When she spoke with me privately, I was initially cautious about opening up. I had been burned so badly by trusting family members that I wasn't sure Margaret would be any different. But her questions were different from the accusatory inquiries I had faced from my parents and other relatives. "Baker, I want you to walk me through exactly what you remember about spring break," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Don't worry about proving anything or defending yourself. Just tell me what actually happened day by day." For the first time in months, someone was asking for my version of events without starting from the assumption that I was lying. I told Margaret about working extra shifts at the campus bookstore, about studying for midterm exams, about the quiet spring break I had spent on campus, while most of my friends traveled to warmer destinations. Margaret took notes as I spoke, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she was actually listening and thinking critically about what I was telling her. When I mentioned the throwback photos I had posted from the previous year's Panama City beach trip, her eyebrows raised with interest. "So you posted old photos as memories, but they were clearly labeled as throwbacks?" she asked. Yes, they had dates and captions explaining they were from the year before. Anyone who looked closely could see they weren't current. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's an important detail. It suggests that someone either didn't examine the photos carefully or deliberately misrepresented what they showed. By Saturday evening, Margaret had convinced my parents to let her review our family's financial records. She framed it as a professional courtesy, offering to help them understand how such incidents could be prevented in the future and whether there were any security vulnerabilities they should address. Dylan tried to discourage this review, arguing that it would be embarrassing for the family and unnecessary given the clear evidence of my guilt. But Margaret's professional credentials and persistent politeness made it difficult for him to object too strenuously without seeming suspicious. The breakthrough came Sunday morning when Margaret was reviewing the credit card statements while drinking coffee at our kitchen table. Dylan was hovering nearby, ostensibly reading a magazine, but clearly monitoring her progress. Margaret had been asking casual questions about the family's financial habits, payment methods, and online shopping practices. "Dylan, you mentioned that you sometimes help your dad organize his financial paperwork," Margaret said, without looking up from the statements. "That's very responsible of you. I bet you've learned a lot about managing expenses and tracking purchases." "Yeah, I try to help out when I can," Dylan replied, his voice slightly strained. Margaret continued studying the documents, occasionally making notes or cross-referencing different statements. Then, almost offhandedly, she asked a question that would prove to be Dylan's undoing. "These Panama City Beach charges are interesting," she mused. "They include some very specific vendors. Dylan, since you discovered these charges, I'm curious if you remember any details about them. Like, what was the largest single purchase?" Dylan's answer came quickly, almost reflexively. "The hotel was the biggest charge. $258 for 3 nights at the beachside resort." Margaret looked up from the papers, her expression neutral but alert. "That's a very specific memory. Did you research the hotel to understand what Baker had purchased?" "I mean, it was right there on the statement," Dylan said, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his voice. Margaret nodded slowly, then turned the credit card statement toward Dylan. "Could you point out that hotel charge for me? I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly." Dylan leaned over the table, scanning the document with growing confusion. The largest Panama City Beach charge was indeed $258, but it wasn't for the beachside resort. It was for a restaurant and entertainment complex called Neptune's Paradise. There was no hotel charge listed anywhere on the statement. Dylan had just revealed specific knowledge about purchases that he could only have known if he had made them himself, and he had gotten a crucial detail wrong because he was working from memory rather than the actual evidence. Margaret's expression remained professionally neutral, but I saw her make a note on her pad. When she looked up, Dylan was staring at the statement with obvious panic, realizing that he had just made a catastrophic mistake. "It's easy to misremember details," Margaret said kindly. "Financial records can be confusing, especially when you're trying to help family during a stressful situation." But we all knew that something significant had just happened. Dylan had revealed knowledge that was impossible to explain through innocent means, and Margaret's forensic accountant instincts had caught him in the act. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Someone with the skills and authority to investigate was finally paying attention to the details that everyone else had ignored. And Dylan's perfect performance was beginning to show cracks that might finally expose the truth. Margaret's investigation began in earnest Monday morning, though she was careful not to alarm Dylan or my parents about the true scope of what she was undertaking. She had requested access to 3 months of financial records, claiming it would help her provide comprehensive recommendations for preventing future security breaches. What my family didn't realize was that Margaret approached this review with the same methodical precision she brought to her professional fraud investigations. She had spent her entire career uncovering financial crimes committed by people who thought they were too smart to get caught, and Dylan's amateurish deception was about to be dissected by someone who had seen every trick in the book. Margaret set up a temporary workspace in our dining room, spreading documents across the table in an organized system that would have impressed any law enforcement agency. She had bank statements, credit card bills online, purchase confirmations and transaction logs arranged chronologically and cross-referenced by date and amount. Over the next 3 days, while maintaining casual conversation with our family, Margaret constructed a detailed timeline that revealed the true extent of Dylan's financial crimes. The Panama City Beach charges were just the tip of an iceberg that had been growing for months. Margaret's first major discovery involved the pattern of small purchases that Dylan had been making since January. He had been extremely careful to keep individual transactions below $50, apparently believing that larger amounts would attract attention. But when Margaret compiled all the charges over a 6-month period, they totaled nearly $2,000. The purchases showed a clear pattern of personal items that aligned perfectly with Dylan's suddenly improved lifestyle. There were charges at clothing stores, electronics retailers, restaurants, and entertainment venues. Each transaction had been spaced out and mixed in with legitimate family expenses, but Margaret's forensic training allowed her to identify the anomalies. What made the case even more damning was the geographic and timing evidence that Margaret uncovered. Using her professional access to enhanced transaction data, she was able to pull detailed information about where and when each purchase had been made. The Panama City Beach charges that had supposedly been made by me during spring break had actually been made online from our home computer at times when I was provably on campus. Margaret cross-referenced the transaction timestamps with my university records, which showed that I had been clocking in for work shifts at the campus bookstore during the exact times when someone was using our father's credit card to make purchases. She also obtained IP address logs that confirmed the online transactions had originated from our home internet connection, not from any location where I could have been. But Margaret's most devastating discovery involved Dylan's Amazon purchase history. By accessing the account linked to his personal email address, she found a comprehensive record of items he had ordered using our father's credit card information. The account showed dozens of purchases dating back to February, including the expensive electronics, clothing, and accessories that Dylan had claimed to buy with his movie theater wages. Margaret also uncovered evidence that Dylan had created a fraudulent PayPal account using our father's personal information. This account had been used to transfer money from our father's credit card to fund Dylan's social activities and gift purchases for his girlfriend Sarah. The PayPal records showed a sophisticated understanding of online financial systems that contradicted Dylan's claims of being a typical teenager who barely understood digital transactions. As Margaret compiled her evidence, she began to see the full scope of Dylan's deception. This wasn't an impulsive teenage mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated, ongoing fraud that had been carefully planned and executed over months. Dylan had systematically stolen from our family while simultaneously building a false narrative that positioned him as the moral authority who had saved everyone from my supposed crimes. Margaret also discovered that Dylan had been researching how to cover his tracks online, visiting websites that explained how credit card fraud investigations worked and how to avoid detection when making unauthorized purchases. His browser history revealed searches for topics like how long do banks keep transaction records and what evidence do police need for credit card theft charges. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence Margaret found involved Dylan's plans for future crimes. His recent large purchases, which totaled over $1,500 in the past month alone, suggested that he was escalating his theft and becoming more brazen about the amounts he was stealing. Margaret found evidence that Dylan had been planning to frame me for an even larger theft, having already made several expensive purchases that he intended to discover later and blame on my supposed ongoing criminal behavior. The evidence also revealed how Dylan had manipulated the original discovery of his crimes. Margaret found that Dylan had been monitoring our father's credit card account online for weeks before he claimed to have found the incriminating statement. He had carefully chosen which charges to highlight and which ones to ignore, creating a narrative that focused attention on the most dramatic incidents while concealing the broader pattern of his systematic theft. Margaret's investigation also uncovered the sophisticated psychological manipulation Dylan had employed to maintain his deception. She found evidence that he had researched techniques for gaslighting and social manipulation, visiting online forums where people discussed how to lie convincingly and maintain false narratives under pressure. By Thursday afternoon, Margaret had assembled a case that would have been sufficient to secure criminal charges in any court of law. But she knew that presenting this evidence to our family would require careful planning. Dylan had spent months building trust and credibility with our parents, while systematically destroying my reputation. Simply dumping a pile of financial documents on the kitchen table would not be enough to overcome the emotional investment our family had made in Dylan's version of events. Margaret also realized that she needed to be prepared for Dylan's inevitable attempts to explain away or discredit her findings. She had seen enough financial criminals to know that they rarely accepted responsibility when confronted, instead choosing to attack the investigation process or claim that evidence had been fabricated or misinterpreted. But Margaret had one final piece of evidence that would make Dylan's denials impossible to sustain. Using her professional connections, she had obtained security camera footage from several of the stores where Dylan had made purchases using our father's credit card. The footage clearly showed Dylan making transactions on dates when he had claimed to be working or studying using a card that he had insisted he never touched. Margaret spent Thursday evening organizing her evidence into a presentation that would systematically dismantle every aspect of Dylan's deception. She prepared timeline charts, transaction summaries, and photographic evidence that would make the truth undeniable even to family members who desperately wanted to believe Dylan's lies. As she worked, Margaret occasionally glanced toward the stairs, knowing that Dylan was upstairs in his room, probably congratulating himself on having successfully destroyed his brother's reputation and stolen thousands of dollars from his own family. But Dylan's moment of triumph was about to end, and the reckoning Margaret was preparing would expose not just his financial crimes, but the cruel psychological manipulation he had used to torment an innocent person. The truth was finally ready to emerge, and no amount of charm, manipulation, or false accusations would be able to stop what was coming next. Friday evening, Margaret called a family meeting under the pretense of presenting her financial security recommendations. She had spent the day finalizing her presentation, organizing evidence, and preparing for what she knew would be the most difficult conversation our family had ever had. Dylan seemed relaxed as we gathered around the dining room table at 7 o'clock. Over the past week, he had watched Margaret's investigation with carefully concealed nervousness, but her gentle demeanor and casual questions had apparently convinced him that she hadn't discovered anything threatening to his carefully constructed narrative. Our parents settled into their chairs with expressions of polite interest, expecting to receive some professional advice about protecting their financial information and preventing future incidents like my supposed theft. They had no idea they were about to witness the complete destruction of everything they believed about their two sons. Margaret began her presentation with what appeared to be routine information about credit card security and online safety. She discussed common fraud patterns, explained how criminals typically operated, and offered general recommendations for monitoring financial accounts. Dylan nodded along, appropriately occasionally asking questions that made him sound responsible and engaged. But then Margaret's tone shifted subtly as she moved into what she called case-specific analysis. She pulled out the credit card statements and began walking through the Panama City Beach charges, in detail pointing out discrepancies that she had noticed during her investigation. The interesting thing about these particular charges, Margaret said, her voice remaining professionally neutral, is that they show a pattern that's inconsistent with typical spring break spending by college students. Dylan's expression remained calm, but I noticed his hands had developed a slight tremor as Margaret continued her analysis. For instance, the timing of these online purchases suggests they were made by someone who was familiar with the family's daily routine and knew when they would have uninterrupted access to computing devices and payment information. Margaret pulled out a detailed timeline that showed the exact times when the fraudulent purchases had been made. She had cross-referenced this information with our family's work schedules, school commitments, and other activities to create a picture of when each family member had been home and able to access our father's credit card information. Baker, according to your university records, you were working at the campus bookstore during most of these transaction times, Margaret said, turning to me with a slight smile. In fact, your time clock records show that you are clocking in for shifts within minutes of when some of these online purchases were being made from this house. Our parents looked confused, but not yet alarmed. They were still trying to process the technical information Margaret was presenting, not yet understanding the implications of what she was revealing. But Dylan understood. I watched his face go pale as he realized that Margaret had uncovered evidence that made my innocence undeniable. He tried to maintain his composure, but his voice cracked slightly when he attempted to respond. Maybe Baker used his laptop to make purchases remotely, Dylan suggested. College students know how to do that kind of thing. Margaret nodded as if this were a reasonable suggestion, then pulled out another set of documents. That's a good theory, Dylan. So I checked the IP address logs for these transactions. They all originated from this house's internet connection, specifically from the computer in your father's home office. She paused, allowing this information to sink in before continuing. I also checked Baker's laptop usage records from the university's IT system. His device wasn't even connected to the internet during most of these transaction times. Our father leaned forward in his chair, beginning to look concerned. Margaret, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that someone in this house was using Mark's credit card information to make online purchases while Baker was provably elsewhere, Margaret replied calmly. The question is who had the access opportunity and motivation to commit these crimes. Dylan's carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack. Sweat had formed on his forehead, and his leg was bouncing nervously under the table. But he made one more attempt to deflect suspicion. Maybe someone hacked our home network? He said, his voice strained. Or maybe Baker gave someone else Dad's card information. Margaret smiled the patient smile I had seen her use with difficult witnesses during Christmas dinner conversations. Those are creative theories, Dylan, but I found something that makes them impossible to believe. She pulled out a laptop and opened it to reveal Dylan's Amazon account purchase history. The screen showed dozens of items ordered over the past 6 months, all paid for with our father's credit card information. This account is registered to Dylan Hendricks at this address using Dylan's personal email address, Margaret announced. The purchase history shows a clear pattern of expensive items being bought with Mark's credit card and delivered to this house. Our parents stared at the screen in shock, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing. Our mother's hand flew to her mouth as she recognized several items that Dylan had claimed to purchase with his own money from his part-time job. Dylan, is this your Amazon account? Our father asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dylan's composure finally collapsed completely. I can explain, he said desperately. This isn't what it looks like. Someone must have hacked my account, or maybe Baker set this up to make me look guilty. But Margaret wasn't finished. She pulled out printed screenshots showing Dylan's browser history, including his research into credit card fraud techniques and his visits to websites explaining how to avoid detection when making unauthorized purchases. I also found evidence that Dylan created a fraudulent PayPal account using your personal information. Mark? Margaret continued relentlessly. This account was used to transfer money from your credit card to fund various personal expenses and gifts. She displayed the PayPal transaction records showing transfers that aligned perfectly with Dylan's social activities and gift purchases for his girlfriend Sarah. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, each piece building on the previous to create an ironclad case of systematic fraud. Our parents sat in stunned silence, trying to process the complete reversal of everything they had believed for the past 3 months. Our mother began crying quietly, whether from relief about my innocence or devastation about Dylan's betrayal, I couldn't tell. Dylan made one final desperate attempt to maintain his innocence. "Aunt Margaret, you're biased toward Baker," he said, his voice taking on an accusatory tone. "You're fabricating this evidence to make me look guilty. None of this proves anything." Margaret's response was swift and decisive. She pulled out her phone and opened a video file that made Dylan's blood drain from his face completely. "This is security camera footage from Best Buy showing you purchasing the gaming monitor that's currently in your room," she said, playing the video for everyone to see. The timestamp shows this purchase was made during a time when you claimed to be working at the movie theater. You used your father's credit card for this $237 transaction. The video was crystal clear. There was Dylan confidently walking through the electronics store, selecting expensive equipment and paying with our father's credit card. He looked relaxed and practiced like someone who had done this many times before. Our father's voice was barely recognizable when he finally spoke. "Dylan, how could you do this to us? How could you let us punish Baker for something you did?" But Dylan's final revelation was yet to come. Faced with undeniable evidence and the complete destruction of his carefully crafted lies, something inside him snapped. The psychological pressure of maintaining his deception for months, combined with the shock of being caught so thoroughly, caused him to break down completely. "You want to know how I could do this?" Dylan screamed, his voice filled with years of suppressed rage and jealousy. "Baker always got everything. He was the smart one, the successful one, the one you were proud of. Do you know what it's like to live in your brother's shadow your entire life?" The words poured out of him like a dam bursting. "This wasn't the first time I framed him. Remember when Grandma's vase got broken when we were kids? That was me. The money missing from Mom's purse? Me. The neighbor's fence that got damaged with the baseball? Also me. I've been setting up Baker for years, and you always believed me because Precious Baker could never do anything wrong." Our parents recoiled in horror as Dylan confessed to a lifetime of deception and manipulation. I sat frozen in my chair, realizing that my entire childhood had been contaminated by Dylan's jealousy and his willingness to destroy my reputation for his own benefit. "I planned this whole thing." Dylan continued, his voice becoming increasingly hysterical. "I've been using Dad's card for months, and I knew I had to find a way to blame someone else before you noticed. Baker was perfect. He was away at college, he had posted those old Panama City photos, and I knew you'd believe me over him because I'm the baby of the family." The confession was complete and devastating. Dylan had not only admitted to the credit card fraud, but revealed a pattern of psychological abuse that had been going on for years. He had systematically destroyed my reputation and credibility whenever it served his purposes, and our parents had unknowingly enabled his behavior by always choosing to believe his lies over my protestations of innocence. As Dylan's sobs filled our dining room, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, grief, and exhaustion. The truth was finally out, but the cost of reaching this moment had been enormous. 3 months of my life had been stolen, my relationships had been damaged, and my faith in family loyalty had been shattered. But for the first time since May, I was free from the crushing weight of false accusations. Margaret had given me back my reputation, my dignity, and my future. The truth had finally emerged, and no one would ever doubt my innocence again. The days following Dylan's confession were a whirlwind of consequences, revelations, and painful but necessary conversations. Our family faced the difficult task of processing not just the recent fraud, but the disturbing reality that Dylan had been manipulating and deceiving us for years. Our parents' reaction was a mixture of devastation, guilt, and determination to make things right. My mother spent hours crying, alternating between grief over Dylan's betrayal and horror at the realization of how cruelly they had treated me during my months of false imprisonment. My father, typically more reserved with his emotions, struggled with anger at Dylan and deep shame about his own failure to investigate the accusations more thoroughly before destroying my summer and my reputation. The legal consequences for Dylan were swift and serious. Our parents, after consulting with Margaret and a criminal attorney, decided to press charges for credit card fraud. The evidence Margaret had compiled made the case straightforward from a legal perspective, and Dylan's signed confession eliminated any possibility of plea negotiations. He was looking at felony charges that would likely result in probation restitution requirements and a criminal record that would follow him for years. The fraudulent scholarship Dylan had obtained was immediately revoked when Columbus State Community College learned about his criminal charges and the false information he had provided about our family's financial hardship. The $1,500 our grandmother had given him had to be returned, though Eleanor insisted on giving me that money instead to help restore my college fund that had been depleted to cover Dylan's fictitious debt. Dylan himself seemed to age years in the space of weeks. The confident, manipulative young man who had orchestrated my downfall disappeared, replaced by someone who appeared genuinely shocked by the consequences of his actions. Whether this represented genuine remorse or simply the natural result of his schemes finally catching up with him was unclear, but the change was dramatic and permanent. The community response was equally swift but more positive for our family's healing process. Margaret made sure that key neighbors and community members learned the truth about what had really happened, particularly focusing on people like Mrs. Patterson, who had been led to suspect me of additional crimes. The speed with which gossip had initially spread my false reputation worked in reverse, quickly replacing suspicion with sympathy and respect for how I had handled false accusations with dignity. Emma's reaction was particularly meaningful to me. She drove to our house the day after Dylan's confession became public knowledge, tears streaming down her face as she apologized for abandoning me when I needed support most. Her regret was genuine, but our conversation helped me realize that the person who had been devastated by her betrayal was different from the person I had become during my months of isolation and false accusation. "Baker, I know I have no right to ask for another chance," Emma said as we sat on our front porch. "I should have believed you. I should have asked more questions. I should have stood by you when things got difficult." I appreciated her apology, but I had grown beyond needing her validation for my worth or innocence. "Emma, I forgive you. And I understand why you made the choice you did. But I'm not the same person I was 3 months ago. And I don't think we can go back to where we were." She nodded sadly, but seemed to understand that my response came from strength rather than anger. The experience had taught me to value people who believed in my character even when circumstances made that belief difficult, and Emma had demonstrated that she wasn't that kind of person. My parents began the difficult process of rebuilding their relationship with me, starting with a series of conversations that were among the most honest our family had ever had. They acknowledged that their rush to judgment had been influenced by Dylan's long history of appearing trustworthy and mature, but they also recognized that they had failed in their fundamental responsibility to investigate serious accusations before imposing life-changing punishments. "Baker, we know we can't undo the damage we've done," my father said during one of these conversations. "But we want to understand how we failed you so completely and how we can make sure this never happens again." These discussions were painful but necessary. My parents had to confront the reality that their parenting had unknowingly enabled Dylan's manipulative behavior while leaving me vulnerable to his schemes. They committed to family therapy both to help Dylan address his psychological issues and to learn how to rebuild healthy family dynamics based on communication rather than assumptions. The most surprising aspect of my recovery was discovering my own resilience and growth. The 3 months of isolation and false accusation had been horrible, but they had also forced me to develop inner strength and self-reliance that I never would have discovered otherwise. I had learned to trust my own judgment even when everyone around me disagreed, to maintain my integrity under extreme pressure and to find value in my own character independent of others' opinions. When I returned to Ohio State for my junior year, I was a different person than the naive 20-year-old who had come home for summer break. My academic performance improved dramatically as I channeled my newfound determination into my engineering studies. I became more selective about friendships, gravitating toward people who demonstrated loyalty and independent thinking rather than those who were easily influenced by gossip or social pressure. Margaret became an important mentor during this period, helping me process my experience and consider how I might use what I had learned to help others. Her professional expertise in uncovering financial crimes had saved me, but her personal commitment to truth and justice had been equally important. She encouraged me to consider a career path that would allow me to advocate for people who found themselves in situations similar to what I had endured. This mentorship eventually led me to change my major from civil engineering to criminal justice, with a focus on financial crimes and wrongful accusations. The experience of being falsely accused had given me unique insight into how innocent people could be trapped by circumstantial evidence and social pressure, and I wanted to develop the skills to help others in similar situations. My junior and senior years at Ohio State were among the most productive and fulfilling of my life. I excelled academically, developed meaningful relationships with professors and classmates, and completed internships with law enforcement agencies that gave me practical experience in criminal investigations. The confidence I had gained from surviving my ordeal translated into leadership opportunities and academic achievements that opened doors I never would have imagined as a naive sophomore. Dylan's path was more difficult, but ultimately included signs of genuine change. His criminal conviction and the loss of his college opportunity forced him to confront the consequences of his actions in ways that his previous manipulations had always allowed him to avoid. He spent a year working minimum wage jobs to pay restitution and legal fees, during which time he began therapy to address the jealousy and entitlement that had driven his behavior. Our relationship remained complicated and probably always would be. I was able to forgive him for the sake of family peace and my own emotional health, but trust was something that would have to be rebuilt slowly over many years, if at all. The psychological abuse he had inflicted through years of false accusations was harder to overcome than the financial crimes because it had shaped my childhood and adolescence in ways that continued to affect me. But perhaps the most important outcome of my experience was the life lesson that emerged from surviving such a profound injustice. I learned that truth has its own power, but it often requires a champion to bring it to light. Margaret's intervention had been crucial, not just because of her professional skills, but because she had been willing to ask difficult questions when everyone else preferred comfortable assumptions. I learned that the people we trust most are sometimes capable of the deepest betrayal, but that justice can still prevail when someone brave enough is willing to stand up for what's right. Most importantly, I discovered that my worth as a person wasn't determined by others' opinions of me, but by my own integrity and actions. The experience taught me to be skeptical of easy explanations and to remember that truth is often more complicated than it first appears. It showed me the importance of having people in my life who would believe in my character, even when circumstances made that belief difficult, and it helped me become the kind of person who would stand up for others facing similar injustices. By the time I graduated from Ohio State with honors and a clear career path in criminal justice, I had transformed a devastating experience into a foundation for a meaningful life dedicated to seeking truth and protecting innocent people. The summer that almost destroyed me had instead made me stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than I ever would have become without facing such a severe test of character. Dylan's betrayal had stolen 3 months of my life, but it had also given me insights and strength that would benefit me for decades to come. Sometimes the worst experiences teach us the most valuable lessons, and sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up making us stronger than we ever imagined we could be. As I look back on that terrible summer, 8 years later, I'm grateful for Margaret's courage in seeking the truth, for my parents' willingness to confront their mistakes and rebuild our family relationships, and for my own discovery that I could survive even the most devastating betrayal with my integrity intact. The truth had set me free, and I had used that freedom to build a life dedicated to ensuring that other innocent people would have someone willing to fight for them when they faced similar injustices. What about you? Have you ever been in a situation where you were falsely accused of something you didn't do? How did you handle it? And what did the experience teach you about standing up for the truth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true stories about overcoming life's biggest challenges. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear about the power of perseverance and the importance of having allies who will fight for the truth. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that even in the darkest times, justice and truth have a way of emerging when the right person is willing to stand up and seek them out. Stay strong, stay honest, and never give up on yourself, even when everyone else seems to have given up on you.